Yeah, this is a Blog Talk Radio conversation with Doug Pagitt and Tony Jones. This is installment 12 of June 9th. It's Tony's third installment, and we do have a call online. We're talking with David here about a conversation we had last week about the constitutionality versus the morality of abortion. And so I don't know, David, if that kind of gets to the question that you were asking. I think Tony said it well there. I mean, I guess you ask a hypothetical. What if we got to the point where, as a society, an unborn child was viewed as a separate citizen protected by the Constitution? That, I guess that would be a game changer, right? If you got if we got to that point. But I think more interesting.
I would agree with your point about changing people's minds as opposed to trying to just legislate and cram something down people's throats.
Yeah, there's always been a dance in this country. If you look at some of the views of the Founding Fathers, they saw the Constitution and constitutionality to be very limited and very specific. The higher calling, they would have said, was human morality and human goodness. That's really what should drive a society, and not the particularities and expressions of law. That law would only come in to give people the freedoms to make moral choices, right? That kind of view. And I think that tends to be right. But then if the morality or the law is not going your way, then people tend to want to change that and make it a more mandated requirement. And that's true on both sides, right? And on changing set of issues. The same people who would argue for great freedom with abortion might not call for great freedom when it comes to taxation. And somebody who calls for great freedom from taxation might not call for it when it comes to abortion. So they're going to switch around depending on the topic. And that's why, in my view, where we are now, and 20 years ago, I don't think this was the case, but an additional 20 years of precedent makes a big difference when it comes to constitutionality, and may or may not when it comes to morality.
And you know what's interesting, Doug, to think about, and what Dave mentions about, we talked about gay marriage last week and kind of those similarities of how does our society take a moral issue and then legally determine it. All along, I've been of the mind, or at least in the last 5 years for sure, that when it comes to same-sex marriage, there's a consensus building, and that 10 or 20 or 50 years from now, the consensus will be, and a lot of conservatives actually admit this, the consensus will be same-sex marriage is just fine. There will always be a dissenting minority who think it's a horrible thing, but there's a dissenting minority who thinks interracial marriage is a horrible thing, right? But what's interesting is that in 30...
I'm with you on that issue, yeah.
Yeah, like in 40 years...
The abortion question hasn't moved.
It hasn't moved more than a couple percentage points up or down, depending on something that happens or who's in office. But we've stagnated. There has been no societal consensus on that.
Now, both sides do say the reason there hasn't been movement is because the advocates of the other position are lying, right? Like and so the hardcore people would say, well, people would be our way if you.
But that doesn't give very much. That doesn't give very much.
But that's
respect
why
to the thoughts of the masses, whereas I think
that's why they keep going, right? That's why billboards keep going out. That's
but we reached a societal consensus on slavery. We reached a societal consensus on civil rights.
Yeah, I don't know.
Not without advocacy. Not without advocacy.
Some people would say that it's the tyranny of the minority, the tyranny of the majority, pardon me, that has to be overcome by legislation. So they would say, if you polled people in 1964, they weren't overwhelmingly for civil rights. But you had to mandate this.
For sure.
So they would say, and people on both sides, if you're on the gay marriage issue in California now it's the tyranny of the majority. Right? If you're supporting gay marriage, because they would say, you can't let people just decide this, it's a moral issue. On abortion, people who are on the side of stopping abortion as a legal practice would say, you can't just let popular opinion drive this. Well, so there's always going to be that argument. We're not simply a representative democracy.
What's different here is
legislative.
What's different with abortion or gay marriage between slavery and interracial marriage is that those were ultimately regional issues. So, no, in the South, there wasn't a consensus. In the South, busing and civil rights had to be forced upon people who didn't agree with it. Forced upon the majority.
Yeah.
But in the North, the majority was for civil rights to end slavery to allow.
But isn't that the same thing with gay marriage? That's a 1-for-1, isn't it? Where
no, because
instead of it being regionally, you just have pockets. You have pods.
But that's why it's
California.
different because that's why it's different because you could say what is a societal consensus. You might even say that at the time in the North to have a. I mean, look, it wasn't a societal consensus. It was a friggin' war over slavery. And then over civil rights, you might say it's because Washington is ultimately controlled by people who went to Princeton and Yale and Harvard and from the northern climes that they were ultimately able to, because that was the consensus in the North. I'm saying there is no consensus yet on same-sex marriage. I don't see one ever happening on abortion. Actually. Maybe unless there's some incredible scientific breakthrough that sheds massive new light on some aspect of being human. But I don't know. That seems very unlikely to me.
Yeah, and this is where the arguments have gone toward late-term abortion, and there's some consensus around late-term abortion versus... But that's, the laws still don't match properly for some people's liking, and so these are complex issues which we have to deal with. So, David, I appreciate your question. And what we were trying to get at last week was the interplay in the religious dialogue between the legal mandates and the moral desires. So, does that do it for you?
That'll do it. Thanks much, guys.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, buddy. Talk to you soon. Hey, welcome. You're always welcome to call in at 646-929-1199. Tony, we are down to our final 3 minutes.
Whatever happened to that guy? That was our first caller we've had in a long time.
That was your
in
first
my
caller.
section. In my section.
Yeah.
What happened to that guy? The funny guy. Wen or Goo or what was his name?
Chum.
Where's Chum Chum?
Chum is with us right now. Chum is listening right now.
Chum, call in.
There he is right now. Chum.
Hey, I saw Hangover last night.
And how'd you like Hangover?
It is funny.
Really?
Yes.
Really? Now you saw Love You Man, and how do you
I
rank
Love You
the
Man.
How
Hangover was smarter.
Because I found I Love You Man to be quite smart.
I Love You Man was pretty smart. Yeah. Hangover is edgier for sure, and pushes the envelope of like humor that makes you cringe a little bit as you laugh.
Like Harry Met Sally. No, like
There's Something About Mary.
Something About Mary when it first came out. Remember that when she comes to the door and puts the
and
gel
there's a
in her
lot
hair
of like
and
jokey stuff like that. But there's also a little bit. It's a little unlike There's Something About Mary. It's not so campy that you're like there's really like there's actually you're on the brink of something really bad could happen here. And here's the other thing that I liked about Hangover. There was not once, and this is unlike I Love You Man, not once was there anything that was demeaning of women.
In I Love You Man?
No, in Hangover. If there anything, it was demeaning of the kind of solipsism and greediness and self-centeredness of men. So I thought Hangover was good. I really do think it was good. I really want to see Drag Me to Hell.
Somebody's got a movie bug. Hey, this is The Question, a Blog Talk Radio conversation with Doug Pagitt, and joined in this segment by Tony Jones. We talk about religion.
I'll be calling in from church camp.
We'll be back
next week.
We'll be back every Tuesday, and be glad to have you all.